All right, so we want to take a few minutes here and talk about the war in Iraq. And what we're really going to be looking at is the backstory, the history, how we got there. So if we look at this, the first thing we need to know is that the last war in Iraq was codenamed Operation Iraqi Freedom. So if we look at kind of our key stats here, we're looking at March 20th, 2003, under George W. Bush. The United States goes into Iraq, and that lasts through December 18th, 2011, when President Obama kind of fulfills one of his campaign promises, and that was to get the U.S. military out of Iraq. So spans two presidents, very similar to Afghanistan in that sense. If you notice the date, we are a couple years, year and a half after Afghanistan for the start of this war, so they're pretty close back to back, and they're obviously actually taking place at the same time. And this one just ends a little bit before, as we know we're still in Afghanistan in some capacity today, where we virtually pull completely out of Iraq, less than 500 troops in 2011. Iraq actually has more military casualties, so we're looking at about 4,500 U.S. military deaths and another 257 or so military contractors. And if you're not familiar with the concept of military contractors are basically outsourced military jobs. So instead of being through the military, they're private security companies that do things like transport diplomats, run security for important people, but they're basically all ex-military. And the advantage is it's cheaper for the companies. They have less rules than the U.S. government has to follow, but it's an advantage for the contractors themselves because they make a lot more money than what military personnel do. So I've known some of my family, extended family, who's done jobs like this, and they did the same things that they did in the military, but they made 2.5 or 3 times as much money. So it's kind of a best case scenario for a lot of people. The downside is the government can't control them quite the same. But there's been 257 of those guys killed. On the flip side of this, the numbers for Iraqi casualties range up to 500,000, depending on how you calculate that. So that 500,000 number is not just killed in violent acts, it's killed or deaths as a result of the war. So you have obviously bombs, gunshots, things like that, but they also, people dying from lack of being able to get to a hospital or from starvation or, all these causes related to war. So by any measure, a lot of people have been affected and a lot of people died because of this conflict. Before we really dig into it, I want to give you the backstory of Iraq, and you guys are obviously too young to remember some of this, and you may have heard about it, you may not have, so we'll just talk about it real quick. We know Iraq's a desert nation. We know that has a really long history. If you go back think of world history, with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a lot of ancient civilizations have been in that part of the world. And if you go back to your world history class, it's the Fertile Crescent, but this is really where modern civilization started, along with Egypt, is in this part of the world. And with the two main rivers that run through Iraq, they have a very long kind of proud history of being an important country. We know that they have lots of oil wealth, one of the world's largest reserves of oil. We also know that it's divided racially and religiously. Basically, not quite equally, but there's 3 main people groups along with a couple smaller ones. But we have the Sunni and Shia, which are branches of of Islam. So they actually believe different things, and they tend not to get along. Same religion, just different interpretations. Those 2 groups don't trust each other. Those 2 groups make up big chunks of Iraq with regards to population. And we have the Kurdish people in northern Iraq, and they don't trust either the Sunnis or the Shia, and they're actually a different group altogether. They're more of a racial group. Kurds are in Syria, Turkey, and northern Iraq, and they actually would like to form their own country, and they have fought for that. So you have a very divided country where you have different groups of people that don't get along, that don't trust each other, all trying to be put into one country. And the history of the borders in the Middle East really go back to after World War I and World War II. we're not going to get into that now, but know that these borders weren't created by the people themselves. They were created by the United Nations in 1920, kind of artificial borders. If the people were going to create their own borders, they wouldn't have been in the same country in quite a few cases. So that's caused a lot of tension and a lot of distrust over the years. So in Operation Desert Storm in 1990, we invade Iraq, and that's George H.W. Bush. So it's George Bush that led the war. In 2003, it would be his dad. And what had happened is Iraq, under its dictator, Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. And the U.S. had a history of helping Iraq. We actually supported Iraq in a war against Iran, in a war that Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against Iran and against some of his own people. And so even though he wasn't a good guy, when it was easy for us, or it was in our best interest, we supported him. But he invades in 1990 Kuwait because he'd been drilling for oil under the Kuwaiti border, and they found out, and he got mad that they were going to cut off some of his wells that were drilled horizontally into the ground to go under the Kuwaiti border, and so he invaded. Kuwait's just a little country. He also threatened to invade Saudi Arabia. So we stepped in and basically obliterated or destroyed the Iraqi army. We were worried that Iraq was going to control like over half the world's oil supply, and that wasn't an option. So that was a fairly popular war thing to do, to step in, but the U.S. stops. We don't go all the way. We don't invade. Our goal is just to get them out of Kuwait. So we stop short of Baghdad. So Saddam Hussein stays in power, and he, after that, doesn't like us in any way, shape, or form, and we don't really like him in any way, shape, or form. So if we look at kind of the details of this, when we look at the case for war, so we're back to 2003, and there's a bunch of reasons why people speculate we went to war, and the President Bush made different cases as to why we went to war, and that's really where we're going to spend a lot of our time, is talking about this idea of why do we go to war. But some of the things that were given: weapons of mass destruction. We said that Iraq had chemical and nuclear weapons that they were willing to give to terrorists. So they had these weapons of mass destruction. We said they'd use them against their own people, and we know he'd used chemical weapons against his own people, that he was threatening Israel, and that he was just sort of a general nuisance, and that he might give those weapons to people that were going to hurt us. So we needed to go get rid of those weapons because he'd refused to give them up. There have been weapons inspectors from the United Nations trying to make sure he did or didn't have weapons, and there's this whole kind of public drama about, does he have weapons, does he not have weapons. Our government went on record with our Secretary of State at the United Nations giving a picture presentation of what these weapons look like with satellite pictures and everything, and the Iraqis denied they had them. The weapons inspectors looking for the chemical and biological weapons and nuclear weapons couldn't find any, but we thought that they hid them, and there's this big drama about weapons of mass destruction and was it worth invading or not. We also invaded because he said he was just a generally bad dude, and he'd killed a lot of people and he was killing people. That was part of it. We said he'd been aggressive against others. We cited the war in 1990 and the war that Iraq had against Iran, and that we couldn't trust him. We tried to make the case for him helping terrorists and linking him to Al-Qaeda. Remember, this is only 2003. The preparation for the Iraq war goes on for about 6 months, so it really starts in 2002. And what we're looking at is a scenario where if we can, if he's with the terrorists that attacked us on September 11, 2001, then this is worth doing. And we also said that we wanted to spread freedom and democracy. And so what we're going to do is spend a kind of a chunk of time looking at, are those legitimate reasons to go to war? Were they true? Were they not true? But those were the reasons that, as a country, the people of the United States were given as to why we were going to invade Iraq and why it was worth invading Iraq. Okay, so in 2003, we're looking at a situation where basically militarily the Iraqis can't function. Okay, they have no way of dealing with our weapons technology. So we invade in March. By April, Baghdad, the capital city of Iraq, falls, and by May it's mission accomplished. So very similar to what we saw in Afghanistan, where very quickly militarily we can run in there. do whatever we want. We don't lose battles. People are dying, but the Iraqi army is more formidable than the Taliban army, but they're absolutely no way that they can fight with us. So by May 2003, we see the mission accomplished thing, and that was in conjunction with the major hostilities ending in Afghanistan. So like 2003, our country's flying high. Like we won both wars, we're good. Now we just got to clean up our mess and create a new government. And there's a famous mission accomplished sign that President Bush had on an aircraft carrier. He flew in a Navy jet with, as kind of like the co-pilot, with one of the guys, landed on this carrier jet and has a big sign that gives a speech, and behind it says mission accomplished. Well, obviously we don't leave Iraq till 2003, so we kind of jumped the gun on that one. But the issue that we have is the occupation phase. Now what do? We can win, we can get rid of the Saddam Hussein government, but now what? So December 2003, we see Saddam Hussein is captured. They find him in a hole in the ground. Basically, he was subject to a pretty big manhunt, a large reward, and they're looking all over the country, and they keep trying to find him. A little bit easier to track him down in Iraq than it was bin Laden in Afghanistan, because Iraq was more of a civilized country. It wasn't mountainous. It was easier to find. The terrain was easier. And so we find him, and he eventually is put on trial and executed. But 2004 is where things start to get bad. So the people that used to be in Saddam Hussein's government, and he was he was Sunni Muslim, so the Sunni Muslims are not real thrilled. Remember I said with the Shia Muslims, and Saddam Hussein was super brutal. He would kill anybody that challenged him. So his basically former government and his former army becomes an insurgency, and they become rebels, and they start fighting against us. And in 2004 that expands, it becomes organized, it gets worse. 2005 we have elections, and we have a new government in Iraq, which is dominated by the Shiites, which is the opposite side that Saddam Hussein was on. There's actually more Shiites or Shia in Iraq than there are Sunnis. So with elections, they come to dominate, and basically you get into a situation by 2006 we're bordering on civil war if we're not at civil war. These two groups don't like each other. They're fighting amongst each other. Each group kind of has like their own official, unofficial, official armies, and there's not any cohesion. It's not Iraqis. It's we're one group and we're the other group. So in 2007. We do the troop surge, and this was the first troop surge, like what Obama later does in Afghanistan, Bush does in Iraq. So we send 20,000 more troops to bring stability to Iraq, and it actually works. It gets better. For the most part, security gets better. By 2010, this is under Obama, we switch our operation to Operation New Dawn, which is giving full control over the country to the new Iraqi government, and in 2011 we withdraw. Okay, so with Iraq, we're in the same place really as where we're at in Afghanistan right now. The legacy of the Iraq War is unknown. In some ways, Iraq is better, but in a lot of ways, it's maybe worse. There might be less stability. We don't have a brutal dictator. They don't have a scenario where someone's going to possibly give away weapons of mass destruction or gas his own people. But we do have a situation now, like we've talked about with ISIS, where there's just no stability at all. There's a lot of fighting amongst the groups. There's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lot of, it's not our job, it's your job, it's not our job. You don't like anybody, we don't trust you. And that's created a situation where terrorism has been able to actually spread and get worse. The guys that lead ISIS actually started in Iraq, and now they're invading part of Iraq. So we don't know exactly what this means, but we do know some things, and that's what we're going to spend some time talking about. But the idea is it's not a more stable place. It is probably a more free place, but it's on the verge of collapsing too. So there's some good and some bad. What I'm ultimately going to ask you to do is to decide whether or not we should have gone to war in the first place. That'll be the first big question. And the second big question is going to be, are we better off now than we would have been if we didn't go to war. So what you guys need to do, if you haven't already, you need to go back and answer the questions on the study guide sheet I gave you. You'll have a short 4 or 5 question quiz tomorrow just to make sure that you did it, just like we did with Afghanistan. That will be on Schoology. And from here, we're going to move forward into what does it mean to go to war? How do we decide when it's a good war and a bad war? And what were some of those causes?